Je laisse rentrer. Ça rentre là. Bonjour tout le monde. Est-ce que tu peux mettre peut-être en mode où on voit les gens? Oui, ça sert à rien. Ah, c'est en mode webinaire.
Ah. Il arrive vite.
Et on attend les derniers secondes.
Ah.
Bien, bien, merci de vous être connectés ce matin.
Thank you for having connected this morning. My name is Mr. Ronan Dantec, a senator for the Loire-Atlantique, and Mr. Antoine Gillod, who is the coordinator for the Observatory of Climate Change. It's a network that is trying to bring together all of the non-state actors. Of course, all of you are aware of the undertakings. There's a yearly publication of a report on the climate action that's actually taking place, and especially undertaken by national state governments, supranational governments, and also non-state actors. So it's the kind of, it's a yearly overview of climate action. Why is that? Because we just don't quite rely upon promises that have been made, but we look at actually the truth of what was undertaken in the previous 2 years. We see which way things are going. We see why emissions are going up or going down. So from this morning on, the 2021 report is online on our website. It's very easy to access. 214 pages, so you need a little bit of time to go through it. And it really looks at all the different movements taking place in the various sectors, real estate, transportation, etc. So it's really important to go into the details of what's actually being done to see what's working correctly, what's not working correctly, and where we're finding difficulties. So there will be a first presentation of this report during the COP at Glasgow previously. But this was given just to the decision makers. But the entire report itself is online this morning only. So Mr. Antoine Gillod will be able to answer any of the questions that you may have from the vectorial points of view. So the presentation that we did at COPE in the beginning of the second week, we really went into detail concerning a few topics, which were then rehashed again at the end of the conference. So why did we insist upon this? We looked at how the emissions have gone up again after the initial impact of the COVID crisis. So we really insisted in the report and the presentation at COPE that the world is no longer one singular type of place concerning emissions. There are differences in various areas, and this is due to structural reasons and economic reasons. And then Europe, North America have been going down, but there's a structural increase in Asia. And then there's the African group, which is the third group, which has seen emissions go down. Of course, you all follow the fact that India was finally against taking carbivore energy sector out of the report. We really insisted in our introduction that there's really a lack of a link up between the previously industrialized countries and the developing countries. So this is really key to understand what's going on currently. We've understood this report has been somewhat of a disappointment following what we could call a failure of the COP conference and the 1.5 degree promise. But despite that, not everything is negative. There are some positive points, and we are emphasizing this. And this is really, and we've been doing this for the past few years, is that we're really concentrating on renewable energies to really stabilize the climate change. Mr. Antoine will come back to this in his presentation. Also, a really important point is the lack of link up between the existing conditions concerning energy and the value chains that have been globalized. And we really have a large demand for tools for this transition. And I think we have to go into that in detail so that we can look at this, see what NGOs are doing about them, but there's more mobilization, especially coming from civil society. So that's what I wanted to say as an introduction. Thank you very much for being here. Of course, we can have a Q&A after Antoine's presentation, which will look at the large transversal takeaways in this. But what's really important in this report is the possibility that it allows itself to go into the details sector by sector. It's online this morning in French and in English, and we are the only organization to do it in a bilingual way. So as I said, in French and in English. This, therefore, makes it easier to access for those who may master one or the other report. So I give the floor to Mr. Antoine. Thank you very much for being here. So I'd like to share my screen with you. To allow you to understand the key takeaways of this report, and also of its new form, because it's the 4th edition of this sector-based global report concerning climate action. So we put it in a new form, which will allow it to be circulated and have more awareness concerning it, because there's a lot of information in it. And one of our key goals is to really have the maximum amount of diffusion. So I wanted to talk about why we put this publication together. We are really focusing on what's being implemented rather than looking at the actual commitments and pledges. So we're looking at facts, quantifiable facts, if possible, to be able to explain how the action is moving forward. This is our main focal point, to really look at it, look at the climate action in a clinical, quantitative way, and why and how civil society, NGOs, and companies are really moving forward with it, to see what's working and what's not working at the international and local level. So we look at the 6 sectors which are emitting in energy, real estate, waste management and industry, and also recycling of waste. So it's new, as I said, because each of these 6 sectors has been broken up into 4 subtopics, which will allow us to look at their interest centers. And we will look at all of the various topics. So what are the indicators? You can see them here. We have a lot of quantitative data, which allows us to look how emissions are evolving and what climate action is actually going through. See what's positive, see what's negative. And this has been summed up here on this page, and it's been well documented. So all of the elements in this report are clickable, so you can click upon them and see where, and then be brought to that to the relevant information part. We also have a summary, which allows you to kind of get acquainted with what we're writing about. So we're looking at 19 trends, which have each about 6 to 8 pages. There are 19 of them, 3 to 5 per sector. Thousands and thousands of sources were used. Reports, academic literature, news topics. And we also wrote a part ourselves, but using third-party experts to really be able to give precise and quantified information to look at what their research topics are, their experience, what they've been doing as consultants. Each of these trends is divided into 2 parts: data overview, which allows you to really read quite quickly how the actions are being undertaken in the various subsector, investments, evolution, for example, in solar and wind energy, and how the impact has been. And then the second part is the observatory's lens. It's a type of cherry picking of the various articles. We've looked at various one subject. We looked at how it has evolved. For example, how have EVs evolved? What are the factors that allowed for this evolution, not only internationally, but also locally? And then the signals. These are press overviews in which we look at regulation changes, market transformations, which show us nowadays what are going to be tomorrow's trends. It's a new way of looking at it, and allows us and yourself to see what's going to happen and what the evolutions are. And then we have case studies, 3 per study, which allows you to really go into the crux of the matters to see what's happening locally on the ground with multiple actors. For example, how solar energy is evolving in Vietnam. So we're looking at 1-page case studies, which then allows you really to get your foot in the door concerning the various topics. So let's look at the key takeaways. You can find them in our publication at the COPE 2 weeks ago. So these 10 takeaways gave us a transversal literature key, looking at the report. And as I said, everything is clickable, and you can really go into the details for each subject that you wish to delve into and that I've just presented. So the first takeaway has been that we've seen that there's been an upswing in emissions following the COVID decrease. And this somehow hides distinct regional profiles. So we've been going at this we've been looking at it since 2015. We see structural trends which are very different between developing countries, China, India, Indonesia, and Russia, and others, and then the industrialized developed countries, but not only in Europe, which see that there has been a decrease over time. And following this structural change, we see that there has been a decrease globally, but that the actual in-depth nature of this impact is quite different around the world. China was able, quote unquote, to decrease its emissions in 2020. whereas the other countries such as United States and Europe were able to decrease their emissions to a much greater extent. So we know that with the upswing after the COVID crisis, that emission levels should go up to pre-pandemic levels. So there are regional profiles which are very different, especially China, for example. This was the main indicator of the various regional players, and this concerns carbon-generated power. China produces the most wind and solar power, but it also produces the most new carbon-generated power. And we all know that the market in China needs electricity. And we also see that India and the United States are really having difficulties breaking away from carbon over the past few years. So what's the link up with forests and emissions? We see that the loss of a forest has gone up in Brazil, for example. However, there has been a slowdown in Indonesia. There was a stop in Indonesia of logging, but we see that this may now start again. This concerns, for example, palm oil. The speaker is speaking way too quickly. This has been going down over the past a little while. There have been enormous forest fires around the world, in Siberia, California, etc. In the Mediterranean basin also. So climate change has an impact on forest fires. However, there has been an impact of the decrease on logging on these forest fires and also emissions. We also look at the adoption of new renewable energies and also the conversion of various economic factors into climate-friendly actors. It has been an accumulation of factors. Combustion and electric mobility has gone up. So, and this is also different as to the various regions. There has been a boom in EV car purchases in Europe and China. We also see that solar capacity has gone up. There has been an increase of solar panel installations. There has also been a market capitalization of Tesla of $1 trillion. There are various contradictions. One of the most telling trends that we've seen is that 2/3 of the best-selling EVs are SUVs, or types of station wagons, which are much heavier than normal cars. They normally weigh about 2 tons, which is much heavier than the average car in France or in the United States, 1.2 tons or 1.8 tons respectively. So we are adapting little by little, and transition is moving forward. So now let's look at electrification of end uses. We're trying to move toward a low carbon electrification. In the first time over 5 years, many of the world's countries have been able to reduce their emissions. And this especially concerns new car sales. But we know that this transition is actually a little bit hidden by the fact that there is no real adoption in the energy mix. So it's going forward, but quite slowly. We also see that railways are becoming more and more electrified. For example, India has done a lot in this domain. But when you look at the railways being turned to electricity, we also have to look at the fact of how is this electricity actually being produced? Is it being produced through carbon energy production? So it's a type of contradiction that has to be underlined. So we have to really go into the numbers and really look at these lack of link-ups and contradictions to see what's happening. 61% of the world's electricity is still produced from coal. So there is a transition at this level that still has to be looked at, especially in the United States. For example, 85% of the coal-fired plants have been converted to natural gas. And this has been the case since 2011. So they are switching and transitioning, but also to the use of another fossil fuel. So it's something that has to be kept in mind. So let's look at the case studies. We're looking at the city of Heerlen in the Netherlands. You can look at really what they have been doing and what is really going to be something to follow in the years coming up. They really are concentrating on local phenomena. For example, that they're really concentrating on geothermic, increase in insulation, electrifying most of the heating of the city. And also they're trying to increase efficiency of the tools at hand. And they were able to do so by really cooperating between the various governmental levels. So if we, rather than calling these things a transition, let's call them accumulations, as I said before. So there is a worldwide demand for low carbon goods and services. And there's a problem is the fact that this demand may be greater than the supply possibilities. We saw this in the bike market, which was very popular during the pandemic, with the putting in place of a very extensive bike network. But we see that nowadays there is a breakdown in the supply chain. For example, wheels, brakes, etc. And most of this is produced in China. So we've seen various lacks, bottlenecks, and delays, which may somehow put a brake on the carbon transition. This is the same thing in other markets when they use, for example, raw materials, for example, strategic metals, for example, semiconductors. All of this is in the report. We've seen that there's been inflation in strategic metals for batteries, for example, nickel, lithium carbonate, and also cobalt have gone up exponentially. And there were shortages or bottlenecks that sometimes took place. We see that electrification of mobility tools has been possible, but there has also been a problem for the worldwide economy to adapt to this. So there have to be regional and sectorial evolutions and adaptations to be able to really come up to the demand. So there's a lot of actors who are industrial actors and state actors who are confronting new challenges in this evolution. There's also been an economic factors, for example, globalization of logistics. We saw that there were many container ships which were stuck in port. And we also saw that fixed costs are also exploding, especially for the merchant marine. Then we see that they had a lot of structural problems, which had an impact on the supply chain. We also have to look at the energy crisis that was taking place in Europe, India, or China. Which showed that some states were having difficulties in really adapting with this carbon and energy transition. It's something that we have to keep looking at. And we will be looking at this in the trends that we have underlined. So adaptation of the economy. So it's a barometer of the commitment since the Paris Agreement. This means carbon neutrality. We looked at the various promises and actual undertakings of the very large companies, 2,000 of them. And we looked at the various oil companies, and we saw how they were really committing and undertaking these net zero targets. So it's really, this report is interesting for many reasons, but not only to look at the actual numbers, but also not only the strategies, but what are the leverages that are being used to really come towards this energy transition. So have a look, especially our oil company analysis for concerning this net zero goal. We saw that various sectors had large difficulties in this. There's been no compensation. We also, this lack of compensation and the structural difficulties gave way to the fact that it's been very difficult for them to achieve their goals. So carbon neutrality. Various companies have had to adapt to it, and this has led to a concentration, meaning mergers of companies. So how are they really undertaking and trying to achieve their goals? Investment capacity in oil companies, especially minerals, has allowed for the fact that they've been able to transition their goods and services toward the low carbon economy. There are various strategic sectors and also joint ventures that are seeing the day, so that they're able to move towards this low carbon or carbon neutral targets. There's also been a vertical integration of the markets. For example, Foxconn, which came into a joint venture with Stellantis, and they were able to work together on EVs. So that means that various actors from different sectors are coming together to work on this topic. For example, the energy transition. It allows companies to save money by investing in renewable energy without having to start from the starting block. This is what we call power purchase agreement. It's essentially large companies and big cities. For example, the GAFA have been undertaken this. And this has allowed them to really have their energy supply 100% renewable. So they're able to somehow dominate demand in these areas. So this leads to a shorter value chain. This is taken in the United States, EU, Japan, Bolivia, etc. And some parts of Quebec have been able to shorten their value chains. They've been able to do this in various industrial sectors, especially, for example, as in the battery sectors, in the recycling of batteries. So these are regional areas which are competing amongst themselves to really be the leaders of the transition sector. So what are the difficulties? To scale up these undertakings that I've just spoken about, and we call it a breakthrough technologies. We're not going to go into them in deep way, but one of the main ones is hydrogen. It had an increasing investment over 2020. It was a large part of the global recovery plans, almost 20 billion over the past year. We've seen this in various states, and we know that the use of H2 is extremely carbon intensive, and that the production of the hydrogen energy and the various parts is still dependent upon carbon-based or carbon-generated energy. So another breakthrough technology that's quite interesting, which is becoming more and more popular, is carbon capturing. It was a type of utopic trend previously, but it is becoming more and more popular. Some oil and gas companies are really starting to look at it. Maybe they're trying to use existing infrastructures and transform them. Sound is off. We also saw that today that the business model of carbon capture depends upon a very carbonated activities. And this is through, for example, through a re-injection of the carbon into the system itself. And this is one of the ways to get away from this is sequestration or carbon capturing, actual capturing, but it's finding it very difficult to find a business model that will allow this to be scaled up. We'll be able to look at this in the various ateliers or workshops during this week. So we've looked at the rebound plan, and we will look at it more in depth. Recovery is being invested in, and it's quite split up between high carbon and low carbon sectors. But there are various leverage effects that have to be looked at. €1 that's invested in the emitting sectors, for example, does not have the same amount of impact, and that same euro may be invested in the low carbon sectors. So we really have to do a follow-up and track these investments over the next years. So what is the role of local governments, which is also a key takeaway? So they are trying to adapt in their own means and measures to the climate transition. In Europe, they have been following the Covenant of Mayors, and they've been decreasing in a large manner the emissions, much more than what they had initially pledged to, and much greater than in the United States. There's a difference in the various cities and regions in the United States concerning transitioning or not transitioning from the carbon economies. You can see it here on the map. There have been state legislation prohibiting local governments from restricting natural gas service. You can see some do, some don't. So is there the idea of a fair transition? And this has to be taken into account in the sectorial and local transition. There has been some success points, for example, cycling, not only in Europe, even in Bogota. And we'll be able to look at this in one of the case studies, which is in the report. Finally, civil society. How is it undertaking its actions? It's changed, especially since 2018. We see that there are various protests in the streets, for example. There has been a time, more and more climate cases are being brought before the court. There were about 1,500 we found in 2020. There were successes in France, Germany, and the Netherlands, which forced the government to really change their benchmark, and which forces governments to really abide by the climate regulations. This was especially the case in the UK concerning the Heathrow airport extension, which was at the end of the day quashed by the court. There's also hand in hand, which goes hand in hand with civil society, is the shareholder activism. We see that this is being looked at more and more in the general assemblies of large companies. There's been many favorable votes. This is often done by the asset managers, which forces the companies to change their business model to be more strategic in the transition towards a lower carbon economy. There's engine number 1, which is really trying to move forward with this. The shareholders of Exxon, Shell, and Chevron have also voted that these companies, essentially from the United States, really reinforce their climate transition tool set. There have been various projects, fossil fuel projects, which have been quashed. There has been cases in Indonesia concerning palm oil, which shows us how civil society and local protests can have an impact. We know that, as I spoke about previously, Indonesia has been going back and forth over the past 4 years, but this allows us to really look at the numbers in this file. You can click on it and in the report, and this will allow us to see where it will be going in the near future. And so I'd like to wrap things up here, and I will answer any questions if there are any. Thank you very much, Antoine. It's a very in-depth presentation of this 214-page report. Sound is off.
Bien.
So if there are any questions that are, if anyone has any questions, do not hesitate to ask them. So coming back to the global synthesis report, looking at the transversal elements concerning the decision makers, it was one of the stories that I spoke about, which allowed us to look at what's happening sector by sector and to see what the various actors are undertaking, governance, companies, civil society. And it also allowed us to look at things on the hot topics. Each person was able to look at what really was interesting. This can be found on page 4, which will allow you to look at the content, to go into the more in-depth analyses, what we call them trends, or also you can look at the case studies, infographics. Sound is off.
Bonjour. Isabelle Malsain de l'agence France Presse.
Isabelle
Donc, vous avez
Malsain
déjà
from
fait ce travail
AFP.
les années précédentes.
You did this over the
Et je
past
voulais
years.
savoir
And
qu'est-ce qui vous
I
a
wanted to
étonné
know
dans ce rapport.
what has surprised you in this report?
Qu'est-ce que vous avez senti de
What
nouveau
did you see that is a real
à la
innovation
même compilation faite les années précédentes?
compared to the same compilation that you've gone through over the previous years? I think it was an important report for one reason, to see how emissions have been going back up after the COVID decrease. This decrease was worldwide. Sound is out. So the first important point, was to know how the emissions were going back up again. I said it in the introduction. I think it's important to say it again. But there's a real link. There's a lack of link up between the previously industrialized companies and the countries and the developing countries. And it's very important, and it shows a lot. You can really see this clearly in the numbers. I'm not sure if it was a surprise today, but this difference is really has to be underlined. And we saw this at the COPE conference, that a lot of the developing countries think that they are not able to decrease their emissions effectively. And this led to problems, especially finding an agreement at the end. So this is an important point. Antoine spoke about it, is that the renewable ecosystem is being really dominated by investment in the oil and gas sectors. So is it a transition or an accumulation? And are renewable energies really being able to supply the demand for energy? Is it breaking the previous fossil fuel energy sector boundaries? But we see large companies investing their profits in renewable energy, which shows that maybe they will change from these large extraction companies to renewable companies. This is something that we saw quite clearly. And even if we said it in March, we see that at the European level, there are numbers that the local authorities are playing quite an important quantitative role in the decrease of emissions. We saw that in the numbers. And the large American regions are also playing their part. And this may be taking part also in the larger regions of the United Kingdom. So it's something that's important. So we're able to see from this report a more complex situation, that we cannot look at things in one light concerning climate, but the large economic players are working for energy transition, even if they are confronted themselves with globalization, even though they may not have been the best players in the question. There was the question of the trillions and trillions of bikes that were actually produced. So before taking the next question, I'd like to add something also. What surprised me is the role of the traditional large companies. They were large fossil fuel extraction and raw material companies. And we see that nowadays they have the will, which may not be sufficient, but we see that they have the will. And we're trying to look at this seriously and look at their pledges, look at their transition plans to really decipher what they're doing and to see if they're actually investing in transition, for example, renewables, hydrogen, breakthrough technologies, carbon capturing. So we wanted to see if and so what we saw is that those who are really concentrating on these sectors were the ones who were making enormous profits over the past century in oil and gas, for example. And we wanted to see do some follow-up on their activities over the next few years to see if this actually bears fruit. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this report. So this is a question which is more technical, if you like. How is this report being analyzed and taken into account by the CNUC? Next question. What has the CNUC really done? What have they taken into account these non-state governors, parties? So, for example, in Egypt, they're trying to develop this Marrakesh agreement. So, have you seen how these undertakings are being taken into account? So, for the first part of your question, it's quite an interesting question. This report has been sent to the CNUC and all to the various stakeholders in the climate sector. So after COP21 in Paris, we had the action agenda, which was the Marrakesh Pact, which was signed in Morocco the following year. And then in Agadir, we hosted one of the meetings for the climate action, which the CNUC was involved in within the Climate Chance Association. So there is a link up. It's a small team at CNUC, at Climate Chance. And then following, it might be technical maybe, then we had the Telenor Dialogue 2 years after, or 1 to 2 years later, which gave way to the best flag points for the non-state and state actors. It was an institutionalized context within the CNUC for dialogue between state and non-state decision makers. It may have been a type of failure when we saw this at the end of the dialogue, because some of the states vetoed over and above the state activities. Some countries said to CNUC quite clearly that they were undertaking something very negative. So it didn't really bear fruit, if you wish. So we didn't move forward. I've been looking after a COPE follow-up over the past 10 years. So there has been progress concerning non-state actors. They were very present in Paris and also in Glasgow. We know that the companies and the regional authorities change their visions always, but the non-state actors are there. Will Egypt try to relaunch this dynamic? It's a big question. It's not the companies which are the least democratic, which are the most supportive of this dialogue. We know that. So I'm interested to see how Egypt will go down the path of trying to relaunch the Marrakesh Pact, but we are in a much better place compared to where we were at Copenhagen. Everybody knows this. Everyone is trying to support this, and state and non-state actors. We're not going back to the starting blocks, but on the institutional level, there's a glass that hasn't been, a glass roof that hasn't been broken. There are various legislative statutes that are still in place that impede this. We see that there's a voluntary exchange, that non-state actors are being included. So I can't tell you right now how Egypt will be able to do this and how they'll be able to relaunch the Marrakesh Pact. So it does exist, but there is a link up to the UNFCCC, but it's very complicated. So this was a long answer, but we're not really sure how we're going to move it forward. Are there any other questions? Any really specific questions concerning specific topics? We'll be maybe focusing at a future point on these very targeted topics and targeted subjects.
Alors, donc, si vous n'avez pas d'autres questions.
So if there aren't any other questions, you got the decision maker's summary. So on our website, we have this sector-based report. So there is the synthesized report, sector by sector 2021 in English and in French. And you'll also be able to find the previous publications. So this is our database of the observatory, case studies, country regional case studies, looking at the sector by sector report. There's another summary that was put together at the end of last year, which would be renewed. We also look at the various UN debates and the hot topics at these debates and the various relevant topics. We were able to make the site more user-friendly. There's a database that will be available and updated. You can consult it regularly. There are various research and reflection topics on the interesting subjects that you may have. We've tried to make it more user-friendly and more intuitive and easier to read. So that's what I wanted to present this morning. So now you know where to get the information that you need. So to wrap everything up, we're going to be looking at this sector, the GSR, the synthesis report, and we'll look at renewable energies, the new energy sources, which are being developed as we speak. And I'd like to thank Alter Ego for being here with us right today for the special report that we were able to put together in tandem concerning by using the climate chance data. So they will be included in the Alternative Economy magazine in December. I think you'll all be very interested in these publications. Thank you very much. Thank you to the colleagues, Samuel, Maureen, and Damien, and all of our team who are behind us. And do not hesitate to contact Virginie Foucault-Gouget, who may be able to help you become more aware of the various topics that we'll be looking at and that have been aborted. Thank you. Thank you very much. It took exactly 1 hour, 56 minutes. Thank you for being here. We've abided by our schedule, so thank you very much. Have a good day.